expecting 100, so the room might be a little bit crowded. I hope you've enjoyed the white wine that was on offer as you came in. Let me explain how the evening, well, it's evening for some of us, will happen. So after I've finished, Martin is going to say a couple of words about the book, and then I'm going to introduce three contributors to the book who are each going to talk for between 8 and 10 minutes about the issues that it raises. And then after that, we're going to have about 20 minutes of questions or discussion. And then Martin will step in at the end to close things. But before Martin actually says his introduction, there was one thing that didn't get onto the agenda for this evening, so I'm gonna take a liberty and insert it, which is a big kind of thank you to Martin for putting this together. And I've got to thank Martin not only for his vision for this book and for other books that he's been responsible for, but actually his hard work in corralling so many contributors to work on this collection. In fact, he made it look easy. So that's very impressive, Martin. And I'd say in nursing, there are very few people actually kind of globally who are promoting and enabling this kind of philosophical and critical debate. And Martin, you're one of very few people globally who are doing this. So thank you very much. And we look forward to hearing a few words about the book.
Okay, thank you, Michael. The money's in the post. Thank you for your generous comments. Well, I'll begin by introducing the book that gave rise to today, and that's Complexity and Values in Nurse Education. And pleasingly, this triptych formed or generated a surprising coherence in the hands of contributors. And I want to invite everyone present to consider asking your respective libraries to purchase a copy. Every library should have one. And I also want to set the scene a little bit for the panel discussion that follows by explaining how or why the book connects with the subject of debate and disagreement in nursing's literature in education. But first, while I'll briefly outline chapter contents in a moment, the book has a subtitle, Dialogues on Professional Education, and this points towards an important feature of the work. Namely, we wanted to do something a bit different with this book. Specifically, the conversations that gave rise to the ideas of the book were occasionally quite vigorous, quite heated, and we wanted to keep this dialogic character present in some way. So, following a foreword by Sally Thorne, the book consists of 9 chapters, but each chapter is followed by a response, sometimes several responses, and also, if required, a chapter author's reply. The work concludes with an afterword by Anne Gallagher. So, in this chapter response reply construction, we keep the argument and disagreement that, as I said, informed the discussions that generated the idea for the book. And although I am biased, I think we managed this reasonably well. So, following an introduction, I kick off chapter 1 with a contribution titled Pain is or may not be what the patient says it is, professional commitments, objects of study, or sacrosanct givens. And I here argue that educators may not introduce relevant and possibly useful ideas to students when those ideas threaten ways of practicing that find themselves allied or attached to versions of nursing's professional values. And I use McCaffrey's ideas about pain to structure what's said. Barbara Pesut then offers the first of 2 responses to the chapter, and Barbara subtly critiques my argument, and I reply to what she says. Franco Carnaval then provides a second response that, in contrast to Barbara, accepts the premises and conclusions I offer, and he suggests ideas about where discussion or thinking might go next. So here we have the exchange of ideas and also the disagreement that we wanted to keep in the book. In chapter 2, Michael Traynor questions whether educators actually or really want a radical or demanding nursing curriculum. He questions whether educators mean the things they say, and he wonders whether they associate benefit with the disruptive reality of engaged, meaningful, complexifying critique. Dawn Freshwater responds, and she picks up on and pushes Michael's arguments further. In chapter 3, Trevor Hussey argues for naturalistic or moral realism. And this argument raises very difficult, very complex questions for nurse educators who discuss or talk to ethical or moral issues in their teaching. Indeed, regardless of whether you are or are not persuaded by Trevor's claims, I expect nurse educators who read this chapter will find themselves challenged quite markedly regards the contents of their teaching. John Paley then responds to Trevor. John disputes the core presumptions that Trevor's argument rests on, and by reply, Trevor rebuts John's challenge. There's a really nice interchange of views here. Pamela Grace, like Trevor, although from a very different vantage, speaks in chapter 4 to complexity and values as they pertain to ethical education. Pam proposes that educators fail to, quote, develop ethically astute nurses, and this for Pam leaves nurses vulnerable to external pressures they might otherwise resist. By response, Joan Lyshenko and Elizabeth Peters contest key grounding assumptions in Pam's thinking, and Pam replies to their challenge. John Paley, in chapter 5, unpacks and critiques the metaphysical assumptions and pretensions that nurse researchers are directed by educators to engage with. This metaphysical discourse is for John almost always ill thought through, confused, simplistic, obfuscating. It underplays complexity and adds nothing of substance to the research projects that supposedly rest or rely on these ideas. Now, John is persuasive, and his critique, once encountered, is difficult to forget. By response, Sam Porter, Margarita Corey, and Hugh McKenna take issue with John's reading of their work and work used by John in his argument, and John replies in kind. Mark Reichjord then offers a second response to John, and Mark's contribution complements and enhances John's claims. In chapter 6, Graham McCaffrey explores complexity and values in education from a hermeneutical vantage, and this, as he shows, allows or brings into view the radical, the disruptive potential of thinking. And Graham's is an intriguing contribution. Michael Traynor, whose own work reaches sometimes not dissimilar conclusions, responds to Graham. Bernie Garrett in chapter 8 examines what he describes as educational entropy. He proposes that nurse educators have failed to adapt and respond to new technological opportunities, new realities. And while Bernie talks about technology, his critique of the ability and readiness of nurse educators to recognize, let alone engage with complexity and complexities intertwining with value issues resonates widely with critiques made throughout the book. Olga Petrovskaya offers a supportive response that pushes what is said in new directions. Helen Rook in chapter 8 asks whether nursing's social mandate remains unfulfilled. And Helen's work generates 3 responses, one from Martin Woods, one from Tracy Levitt-Jones, and one from myself. These responses vary in their enthusiasm for the idea and plausibility of a social mandate, and so we have a nice range of ideas here to which Helen briefly responds. Lastly, in chapter 9, I explore complex and value-laden problems that educators fail to recognize or engage with vis-a-vis non-nursing literatures that speak to or are relevant to nursing questions and issues. And the work of Quinton Mellissieu is used to argue my case. By response, John Paley pulls apart aspects of my argument, and I reply to John's broadside. Mark Reichjord then offers a second response, and this repositions what is said, and Gallagher, as previously mentioned, offers a final complimentary afterword. Okay, that's a drastically simplified outline of the book. But why a discussion and debate about disagreement in nursing? Well, during and also after the book's production, how and when we disagree with each other and how disagreement is and sometimes is not allowed or permitted kept cropping up. This became a recurring theme. Speaking personally, I do not think that in our literature, in education, I don't think we're as prepared and ready to discuss and contest arguments and ideas as we should be. And this problem speaks to something radically amiss in nursing. Of course, discussions about argument and its limits are easily hijacked hijacked or sidelined by hot button issues of various sorts. However, while we ought to be able to talk through difficult topics of all sorts, that's not what interests me. Rather, my concern is more pedestrian. In putting the book together, more than one person questioned whether they really could critique what someone else had written, and that seemed odd. It's odd because critique is vital, it's necessary for argumentative development and understanding. Anyway, I'll now hand back to Michael and he will introduce the panelists to develop this further. Just one last comment. Don't forget to ask your libraries to order the book. It is, comparatively speaking, in our literature at least, a bodice ripper of a read. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin, very much. So our first speaker is Sally Thorne. She's professor at the University of British Columbia in Canada. She's also editor-in-chief of the journal Nursing Inquiry, and I see from the website she's been in that role since 2011, which is an amazing achievement to be editor on a Wiley journal for that long. So you're definitely a survivor. So Sally, the floor, the room is yours for the next 8 to 10 minutes.
Thanks so much, Michael. And it's so much fun to be here with so many old friends and new and so many colleagues. We really do need to figure out how to do this more often. I'm normally in the west coast of Canada. Today I'm in Toronto on the lands of the Mississauga of the Credit, Anishinaabe, Chippewa, Haudenosaunee, and Wendat people. And I had the best job in this whole book. I really got to write the foreword and to talk about how excited this made me. I have never seen such a wonderful collection of complex papers and arguments, and have absolutely enjoyed being able to put some thought to it. When I was a PhD student myself, about 35 years ago, I indulged in some of the literature of other disciplines, philosophy, sociology, and anthropology, that had recorded so many of the fabulous bun fights among the scholars of the day. You know, you could just see them going at it in the written word that had been recorded. And I remember feeling so envious that we did so little of that in nursing. We didn't have that give and take. You know, I still have these images of Wittgenstein going at Karl Popper with the fireplace poker in the Moral Sciences Club at Cambridge. And, you know, we just don't get lively like that, with the exception perhaps of John Paley, who will liven up any argument. But for the most part, in our nursing discussions, we're fairly common, fairly civilized. And so that's what caused me to be so excited about this particular book. It got me reflecting on how we've not really created this culture of encouraging or welcoming debate on important issues. And we're in complex times, as we all know. Nursing education's in complex times in which there's so many sensitive issues at play: public health policy, reproductive rights, anti-racism. We've seen them writ large in the public press in recent years. And I think that we really are increasingly at risk for silencing contrary opinions and perspectives. As we all become so keen at being politically correct and part of the appropriate movement. And so that's what struck me about this book, and it's perfect timing as a departure from the vast majority of the things that we publish. I think that I'm speaking today mainly from the perspective of a journal editor, and I think that so much that what we see in what we consider scholarly literature in nursing is in the form of formal scientific research, extending the evidence basis for the approaches we take to practice and the decisions we make on behalf of populations and people in the public domain or students and curricula in the world of professional education. We really are quite addicted to the idea of science as being the most appropriate form and format and structure by which to make our arguments. But science is only a very small strand in all of what we have to consider if we're to produce a next generation of nurses who actually have the potential to be thought leaders and to take the profession forward. So I think that's to me what was so exciting about this book is that it really did grapple with the question of are we thinking about nurses as thought leaders? Are we doing anything intelligent to prepare them from that? So some of the things that I see from the perspective of a journal editor, a journal editor is in the very fortunate position. Some of you I know are journal editors. You're in the fortunate position of seeing a background debate that for the most part stays behind the curtain. The author may see some of the peer reviews, the peer reviewers may see author comments, but very little of that makes it into the public domain. Peer reviewers have a lot of control over what gets published, therefore career productivity, and they're doing that on a a very anonymous basis for the most part. Now, we do have a newer trend toward open peer review. My own view on it is that I don't think that's going to help much. I think it steers us toward a bias for favorable responses. It's so much easier, we all know, to write that peer review and have it be open access if you happen to like the paper. Or alternatively, in some instances, we see it as an opportunity to pontificate and express contrary opinions, to just take aim at an author. And so I have a feeling that many thoughtful and critically reflective reviewers will increasingly decline these open access options. And so we will get, we all get exponentially more invitations than we can accept, I suspect. And so we steer toward those in which we can be comfortably anonymous. Now, I think that the power of the peer reviewer is a problem. We are giving people anonymous access to, take issue with ideas that inflame or excite them. Often peer review is based on opinion or preference or positionality. And in peer review, we do have the ability to influence the nature of the ideas that are going to influence the discipline and the manner in which those are expressed. I think that some very interesting ideas, complex ideas, will not see the light of day in the published nursing literature. And often peer reviews are responsible for that people's anxiety about appeasing peer reviewers causes them to comply with what they think is the direction that they want to go, rather than fight back. And this is particularly the case for newer scholars who are very keen to have their work published and not necessarily feeling sufficiently confident to fight back, as it were. So I think that the collective infliction of stylistic and philosophical bases on the author, the things that we do to pitch challenges at their truth claims, to sort of expertly express our opinions and guide them into the papers we think they ought to write, we meaning peer reviewers, is a little bit of a problem. And it does create a fascinating dialogue, but not one that we really have the capacity to expose until we get into a wonderful collection like this. But I do think that most of us are hesitant about exposing ourselves in the modern world to the predictable backlash of expressing certain controversial ideas. We all have a pretty good sense of which are the popular topics and which are the popular stances, and a bit more hesitation on issues that feel a little bit more dangerous. And I'm thinking particularly about social and political issues, which are an incredibly important part of nursing thought leadership. We sometimes feel that certain ideas are not, because of our positionality or identity, be legitimately ours to express. And that would be the case, for example, for someone who has the physical appearance of me in conversations with regard to race and racism. I have a visible perspective that may legitimize certain kinds of claims and not others. And so I think we have to be mindful of these prevailing currents of peer pressure that exist in the disciplinary and academic universe, so that we're not unwittingly exacerbating the problems that we intend to solve. We know for sure which opinions and stances will curry favor with the discourses of political correctitude, and on matters of race, gender, social justice, climate action, healthcare equity. We can all safely guess which claims will provoke an audience cheer and which might set us up for public humiliation on social media. And although I think most of us here today actually hold strongly to the positions that I articulate in written form, such as opinion papers and editorials, there's a significant danger in the self-satisfaction and certainty that I am right, or the certainty that there may not be another layer of analysis that I haven't yet entertained that would shift my position with comfort over time. And in Canada, we've had a recent situation that's really caused me to reflect on this, a particularly sensitive and difficult conversation going on. Canada is a country that, until recently, prided itself on its commitment to justice and fairness to all. And we've had to face the overwhelmingly clear evidence that our colonial history has devastated Indigenous communities. So we, and I mean by this universities, professions, and all of society, are scrambling quickly to be seen to be on the side of undoing and rectifying the effects of that colonial past. And toward this end, we've created an extensive network of opportunities to support rapid advancement of Indigenous persons across all sectors of society. Because our colonial structures and systems had created all these exclusionary rules about Indigenous status, such as removal of status from Indigenous women who married out of the community, we accepted as appropriate the preference, the Indigenous preference for self-identification as to who was and wasn't Indigenous. However, now we're faced with the probability that this self-identification has led many with quite dubious Indigenous status to take up those funded university seats, those faculty positions, those academic chairs that have been created in an effort to try and begin to rectify the challenge. So to me, this is a perfect example of how something that seemed fundamentally true and supportive of right action at one point in time can be seen to be contributing to a problem in the next. And as an editor and author and mentor to newer scholars in the field, I think I and probably we need to be mindful of the reality that we only know what we know now, and that there's a high degree of likelihood that we may know more with more layers of complexity into the future. So why does this matter? Well, I think that there's a million reasons for us to steer clear of certain issues and topics and positions, recognizing that the printed word exposes us to such difficult challenges going forward. Once you've written something, it's there and you can't take it back. And yet I believe that if we fail to engage ourselves and our next generations of nurses and nursing students in the complicated debates of our time, we will have lost our relevance as a force for social good with a collective mandate to make a difference. And I do firmly believe that that is our reason for being. And that's why I cheer so loudly for a book in which respected authors, wonderful respected authors, allow their work to be vulnerable to critique, and in which the critics haven't held back in trying to illuminate what they see as the important issues. Nobody's soft and gentle with the authors in this textbook. They're going right at it and arguing their perspectives. So I think when we do this with genuine respect and a commitment to the inherent value of disputation and argumentation, and we show that we can do this publicly and collectively, we do our discipline a genuine service. So I'll leave my thoughts there and pass the virtual microphone, I think, over to my wonderful colleague, Barb Pesut.
Thanks, you. Michael. Thank you very much, Sally. I'm sure people will be picking up some of the strands of your argument later. I look forward to that. Our second speaker is Barb Pesut, and she's Professor and Principal Research Chair in Palliative and End-of-Life Care at the University of British Columbia, which is still in Canada, as it was half an hour ago. I just, again, a quick look at her CV. I noticed that, Barb, you started nursing the same year that I did, which is 1982.
Yes.
Which is a kind of, feels both recent and ancient. So, Barb, over to you for the next 8 to 10 minutes. Look forward to hear what you've got to say.
Oh, thank you so much, Sally. Thank you. That was wonderful. You'll hear some shades of what I'm going to talk about here today as well. And I can't tell you how thrilled I am to be speaking alongside two thinkers who have really profoundly shaped how I think. I owe a debt to both of them, for they've really been the ones who've given me the permission to debate and disagree, something that I think I have never been entirely comfortable with. I remember many years ago entering into a debate about spirituality with John, although to call it a debate is a bit of a misnomer. I think it was more like a first round knockout, but he really started me on the path of having permission to challenge ideas and has really set the bar for so many of us. And really, Sally has done the same. I still laugh when I think of her article, Disimpacting the Debates, in which she took on some of the shifts occurring in nursing thinking. I was her doctoral student at the time, and that article taught me that it was okay to resist the thought police. So these two are not afraid to engage in ideas that steer nursing in a particular direction. But you know, something has changed in our current climate that really makes me uncomfortable once again. It feels remarkably akin to my socialization as a young person growing up in a very British home where it was more important to be nice than thoughtful. I feel like we've entered a time where speech has closed down to the point where it's almost impossible to get to the level of debate, at least in areas that really matter. To give some context to my talk, let me share 3 scenarios. In the first, I was teaching a nursing research class, and naturally we were discussing evidence. A student put his hand up and went on to explain how his community had a means to treat and even cure cancer through a holistic natural product that had none of our toxicities of Western treatments. I honestly had no idea how to respond. This was an ethnically diverse student whose views of health differed from what we teach in nursing classes. In the second scenario, I was part of a research team in which we were using fairly standard research language in a discussion, and I could see one of the participants becoming visibly distressed. Finally, I had to inquire about what I was seeing. The participant informed me that our language was triggering them. The third scenario happened when I was teaching relational practice. A student left the classroom abruptly and returned later to tell me that she just couldn't sit through this topic because of her personal history. I'm sure you'll recognize the important ideas inherent in these scenarios, such as trauma-informed care, cultural safety, and diverse worldviews. But what I don't know is how we speak within such a climate, let alone engage debate. So you'll notice a common thread among these scenarios. I'm immersed in the Western ideology of how we produce knowledge, how we talk about that knowledge, and how we relate to one another. My very act of speaking from that location, and in a context where no argument or really debate was involved, evoked a response. My intent was to be respectful and sensitive, but I no longer know how to do that within the role that I play, to produce evidence for a practice discipline within a particular worldview. It feels reminiscent of the paradigm debates decades ago, where we wondered whether we could even speak intelligibly to one another if we were holding different views of the world. I think some of this dilemma has occurred as a result of our emphasis, at least in Canada, on a social science foundation to the discipline, and in particular, the widespread adoption of critical justice theory as the underlying paradigm that informs the discipline. You may recall an article by Annette Brown published almost 20 years ago in which she foresaw some of the fault lines inherent in a critical social theory approach to knowledge development. While acknowledging that this particular theoretical lens supported nursing's moral ontology, she foresaw some of the challenges that would develop for nursing's epistemology. So I'm going to talk a minute about critical justice theory, so let me clarify what I mean. It's a moral and theoretical movement in which knowledge depends upon our cultural context, and as such, these knowledges are epistemologically equivalent. Knowledge is typically created by certain powerful factions of society and is used to oppress persons who are defined primarily by group identity. It's a profoundly appealing theoretical movement because it really calls to the good within us. We want to be free from oppression ourselves and to bring that to others. And it gives us meaning and purpose in a world that can be both disorienting and dehumanizing. So I think it brings something invaluable to our scholarship, but I'm less confident in the ways it's being taken up in the world of practice and our abilities to prepare practitioners for that practice. You see, from a scientific perspective, I can still debate claims. We can hold knowledge tentatively, we're skeptical of it, and we test it rigorously using common methods to see if we can disprove it. In contrast, from a critical justice theory approach, we adopt a lens that then shapes everything that's allowable. So you can hear the shades of Popper here. Sally, it was interesting to hear you mention that as well, who was theorizing about the boundaries of science in the wave of Freud and Marx. He said it constituted science if we could disprove it. whereas the psychological and economic theories at the time provided a worldview that determined what one might see. And I think critical justice theory might be similar. It begins from a set of assumptions about the world that then structures the allowable conversation. So if that's the case, on what grounds can we debate? If knowledge is socially constructed and equivalent, then on what grounds can I challenge views in the classroom that don't align with our epistemological traditions in nursing? If the world's about power and injustice, then what right do I have to impose my colonialism on others, or even to enter into a debate if I'm assuming that my debate partners could be harmed? Can I challenge student worldviews? Do I need to reconstruct my scholarly language? And should I avoid topics in the classroom that might trigger students? Indeed, I've had to ask myself whether I even have the most basic understanding to speak across these differences. How we often approach this in our scholarly work is we write something championing the oppressed and then make an acknowledgement at the end of our limitations as white, cisgendered people. So you can see where I'm going with this. This would be less of a problem if all we had to do within the discipline was theorize. But what about our social mandate to produce practitioners who will work largely within health systems that are still based within Western scientific and economic assumptions? And here I'm going to draw on Sally's work in The Logic of Nursing. She suggested that our underlying foundations must be pragmatic, based within empirical evidence, while having an appreciation of the contextual realm from within which we're operating. This means that the knowledge we produce must have real cachet in practice, it must be empirical, and yet it must be also sensitive to our context. Honestly, it's taken me a long time to think through the essence of what my challenge is, but here it is. There are very real implications of adopting the idea of epistemological equivalency, even for equity purposes, and we can't simply give lip service to it. Because the reality is that worldviews and epistemology are inextricably bound. Let me be more specific. If my first year student comes from a culture with different views of health and healing, I really only have a few choices. I can accept that, full stop. I can reject that on the basis that the student is being prepared for practice within a Western context, or I can try to bring reconciliation between the two worldviews in some sort of compromise. And I would argue that these three choices are really being played out at a much broader level every day. Now, naturally, the third choice seems to be the optimal one, but it assumes that we can have conversations about reconciling and prioritizing epistemologies. But that's not a conversation we can typically have. In a polarized speech context, such as we've had today, and Sally talked about that, we're not encouraged to talk about how we bring reconciliation to these views. We operate in a time where every statement is scrutinized, underlying intent is often attributed, and all too often weaponized with serious consequences. So, our reconciliation is to peoples, and rightly so, but we can't separate people from their contexts. To do so is really to turn our reconciliation into rhetoric. But then it leaves us with the difficult question of how we reconcile these worlds of ideas within a practice discipline. And here is where we need conversation, a word I think I like a bit better than debate. Do we try to find ways to bridge epistemological equivalencies, or do we bring radical transformation by burning the bridges? My research colleague, who was morally distressed, believed in the second approach, while I was trying to negotiate the first. And I confess, I'm not sure of the right way forward. Indeed, I suspect it is only through conversation that I can be informed enough to make a decision. So thank you, and I look forward to our conversation.
Thank you, Barb. The complexity seems to be kind of piling up as we go through the evening, perhaps unsurprisingly. So thank you very much. Our last contributor is John Paley. He's the Honorary Fellow at the University of Worcester, the Three Counties School of Nursing and Midwifery. So John, over to you for the next 8 to 10 minutes.
Thank you, Michael, and thanks to Martin for the invitation to this event and indeed to contribute to the book. It's interesting that the two contributions we've had so far have been as they are, and that they are prompting all kinds of thoughts in me. And in effect, I'm going to be taking issue, I think, with Barb, at least indirectly. But only by implication, but Barb and I are used to disagreeing with each other, so that's no great problem, I don't think. I'm going to start with something personal in the sense that it's related to what I'm working on at the moment, and then broaden to issues in terms of the role of argument, criticism, disagreement, debate in nursing and some other disciplines. I'm currently writing a book about an orthodoxy that goes back 40 years, give or take. It's a development of some of the themes in my contributions to the Complexity and Value book. The view in question is that research of any kind requires philosophical foundations, philosophical underpinnings. This is true for all research, it's claimed, but it's qualitative methodologists in particular who are keen to talk about it. If you open any, almost any, methods textbook, you'll probably find somewhere in the first couple of chapters a discussion, however brief, of ontological and epistemological beliefs. Usually, perhaps less so these days, organized around the idea of paradigms. This idea was kind of developed in the 60s and 70s, but became canonical in the 80s. Particularly after the publication of Lincoln and Guber's Naturalistic Inquiry. The thesis of my book is that ontological and epistemological beliefs, at least as they are understood in that literature, actually can't have the function they're supposed to have. This is mainly because the sentence is concerned, I mean, to take the most simple and obvious examples, things like there is a single objective reality, or alternatively, there are multiple socially constructed realities, don't say anything. They tell us nothing. They aren't reality describing in the way that they seem to be. They're not exactly meaningless, but they might just as well be because their information content is more or less zero. They seem to inform us of something, but that is literally, I think, an illusion. I'm about halfway through this book, and already the questions are beginning to resound in my head. In particular, how is this book going to be received? I think there are two problems from that point of view. First, a lot of people won't like the main thesis, obviously, and will either ignore it or reject it out of hand. I think actually that's perfectly legitimate, because a lot of authors are heavily invested in the idea of philosophical underpinnings, or these days philosophical alignments, I guess, and are far too busy to spend time getting to grips with a book that questions that. And why should they? It's only one book. You need a few more to get you thinking, maybe there's something in this. And the second issue is that the methods by which I try to make this thesis plausible are unfamiliar. Readers are going to expect, I think, a lot of the time, the usual kind of discussion about realism, relativism, positivism, pragmatism, constructivism, and various other isms. But I won't be doing that because, well, basically, I don't like any of them. Realism is no more sensible than relativism. Positivism is no more illuminating than constructivism. From my point of view, the debate about isms is just a way of keeping the whole depressing cycle of metaphysics going. The methods I use draw on a number of sources, including Wittgenstein, Carnap linguistics, and close reading from literary criticism. And you don't see too many references to those in the methods literature, some but not many. So that could be another obstacle. So that's two reasons why the book is going to have an uphill struggle getting itself read. It will be seen as critical, obviously, possibly destructive. If previous experience as a guide, people will attribute to me things I didn't say, and even things that I went out of my way to emphasize that I wasn't saying. And I may hear again, an old friend, a question that I heard numerous times a few years ago: what makes you think you're right and everybody else is wrong? I think a major problem here, and this is where I begin to swing back to the topics that we are debating this evening, is that a lot of academics, and this may sound strange, don't really understand the function of criticism, argument, disagreement. I'll give 3 examples from my own experience. Start with the what makes you think you're right and everybody else is wrong question. It's odd on several counts. I mean, one is that I explained why I take this view in the paper that you just read or that you just listened to. So why isn't that an answer to the question? Another is the implication, I think, that it seems to be that if I'm not writing stuff that people are likely to agree with, then maybe I shouldn't be bothering. But I can't see the point of writing stuff that everybody's going to agree with. And a third is the question implies that the really important issue is who's right and who's wrong, who won, who lost. And I think that completely misses the point. Second example, in one book proposal, I said that I wasn't in the business of trying to persuade other writers to change their minds. One of the proposal's reviewers said I was being disingenuous. Of course I wanted to change their minds. What was the point otherwise? It was obvious, the reviewer said, that what I really wanted to do was to get these writers to admit that they'd been wrong. I think that misses the point as well. I think it's actually quite a serious failure to understand why we should be critical and why we should disagree with each other. And then the third example, a few years ago, I wrote a book about that form of qualitative research that is described as phenomenology. And following its publication, various people said various things about it. 2 authors in particular took up the cudgels against it in their reviews. And in reading their articles, it became apparent, interestingly, that they were both unused to being criticised. They were actually unused to criticism, and that neither of them actually knew how to deal with it. They flailed about, they systematically misread the book, they made lots of ad hominem comments, and they came up with a lot of sublimely daft arguments. Neither of them seriously engaged with what the book actually said. In one email, I was asked why I was trying to destroy the guy's life work. It's difficult to imagine any of that in mainstream philosophy, which is my home discipline, so it's my basic point of reference. In philosophy, for the most part, carefully argued disagreement is actually part of the joint enterprise. That might sound a bit paradoxical, but criticism is a service that you provide to your colleagues and which they provide to you. It sharpens your thinking, it makes you refine and recalibrate your arguments, and it helps you to improve those arguments and develop your ideas. That's why in the acknowledgement section of a philosophy book, this is just a straw in the wind, you often interestingly find authors thanking writers whose views you know are diametrically opposed to their own. So that's one primary function of criticism and disagreement. Here's another. The principal effect of academic exchange isn't on the immediate participants. A argues her corner, B argues his. They disagree, perhaps vehemently, but neither of them is going to change the other's mind. I mean, it does happen occasionally, but it's rare. A is not going to convert B to her way of thinking. B won't be getting A to confess that she's wrong. The real question is what the audience makes of it. The people who read and listen to the debate between the 2 of them. They're the ones who sift what's being said and decide how, if at all, they will amend their own thinking. Perhaps on this topic, perhaps on a related topic, perhaps, interestingly, on a different topic altogether, because that happens as well. So the 2 disputants are providing a service again. The debate appears to be gladiatorial, perhaps, but both authors are providing their audience with food for thought. When you put it that way, it kind of sounds obvious. I mean, I think it is obvious. But people who ask questions like, why are you trying to destroy my life's work, or what makes you think you're right and everybody else is wrong, apparently forget it. Maybe it's a sign of a mature academic discipline is that people don't forget. Nursing's a relative newcomer to the university sector, but I think it's getting there. I mean, I've been associated with nursing as a sort of camp follower for about nearly 30 years now, and I've seen that development. Certainly, there are plenty of nurses, including the people involved in this book and in this event, who do understand what the function of debate and disagreement is. There are lots of authors out there, apparently, in disciplines other than nursing, who don't understand it. So even if there's still work to be done, and I agree with both Barb and Sally that there still is, I don't think necessarily that nursing suffers unduly from the comparison. I'll stop there. Thanks for listening.
Right, thank you, John. So I presume it's okay to finish a bit later than past, because that will give us time to have a discussion. I'm just conscious that we've got loads of themes that have been kind of put into this, and there's a danger of kind of not being able to follow any of them. So I'm going to risk some kind of really simplistic kind of summary overview. It seems that there's complexity enough if we kind of look at debate within academic life, if you like, as I think John was doing. But the complexity gets made more acute when we, as part of our kind of work, we're sort of forced to engage with people that you could say are on the margins of the academic world, or our students or fellow participants. And that means that if you're like me, you're hoping you can avoid having to kind of deal with these issues. But actually there's an unavoidability about having to kind of not only think about them, but actually to act, unfortunately, and make decisions. So the complexity and the sort of urgency is kind of unavoidable. So that, you know, let's get started with the discussion. So there's a number of ways that you can signal that you want to say something. You can click on the little person with their arm in the air. You can write something in the chat, or you can just kind of wave your arms around. In fact, no, don't wave your arms around, because if your camera's not on, that's not going to work. So say something in the chat, or click the little person like that, and hopefully between myself and Martin, we'll identify you, and you won't be sitting there all evening being ignored. So over to you. Sally, yes, this is like a panel game. Sally, yes, please.
Sure. As both Barb and John were talking, I was reflecting on the last couple of years we've all been through, and some of the politics around the vaccination and the anti-vax view, which has been a very interesting one for nursing. It's a different case example than the ones that you raised, Barb, but it's certainly one that many nurses encounter all the time. Somebody who holds a particular view that vaccination is a communist plot or something, you know, some kind of conspiracy. And to me, that's been an excellent example of what I do believe are some of those foundational realities that our discipline holds true. You know, John, I think that's a context in which the thing you're referring to as the positivism and realism underlying our research does ring true for nurses. We could do lots and lots of qualitative and experiential research, but we are not collectively as a discipline anywhere in the world opposing a vaccination movement. In fact, we're celebrating that and taking that on quite seriously. At the same time, in terms of that human engagement and the respect for different positionalities, we are helping students ensure that they're taken care of patients who might hold those views and family members who espouse it very sensitively and thoughtfully. We might engage with those views, we might try and change them, or we might just agree to disagree. So it struck me that that really has been quite a useful case in point to reflect on what I believe is a foundational perspective that we probably agree on is the right and proper response to nursing. And just because I can think of a case example like that, it takes me back to the idea that the two have to find their way in not compromise, but in sort of multiple lines of engagement in the context of these complex issues. Thanks.
Thank you, Sally. Right. I presume everybody can see Miriam's comment in the chat.
No, Michael, I can't. I saw something flash up and I can't see it now. Can you read it out?
It's long. Okay. Or Miriam, why don't you speak? That's much better than me just reading what you've already written eloquently.
Oh, hello?
Is that Miriam?
Yes.
Great.
Do you want? Okay. I guess I'm sharing my video and I'm.
Yeah.
Okay.
The
So
floor is yours.
these are the thoughts that I had. Thank you so much for this fantastic discussion and debate, and it was just really an honor to listen to everybody's talk. The thoughts that I was thinking were, as Sally expressed at first, you actually said the word trust as, you know, kind of being this foundation for respectful and honest, potentially fruitful debate. And so that made me think about whether, you know, what we should be thinking in terms of nursing education is trust building, or my words were interrelational communication. But then Barbara, you brought up this beautiful idea of conversation, in addition to, or perhaps anticipatory of principled debate. And then when John, when you were talking, it seemed to me that you were providing a very different foundation for debate, which is logical consistency. So that then got me confused, because as Sally and Barbara were putting forth very eloquently, I thought, in nursing, logical consistency for any of us who have practiced recently is pretty much not in play for the majority of the circumstances that we're involved in. So in terms of educating nurses in the context of complexity, could perhaps trust building become this idea with robust viability? And, you know, because if we're thinking about, is really the idea of the nurse to logically debate a patient into compliance, for example, with a medication, or is the nurse's job to access the patient's circumstances and work out what is going on that makes taking a medication difficult or unpalatable, you know, as the very first step in putting forth potential solutions? So I guess my final Sally is the question of logical debate perhaps the wrong question to be asking in the context of nursing education and the role of, quote, good nursing in healthcare? Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Miriam. So Paul Snelling has put his hand up. So rather than asking the speakers to respond, Paul can say something, and then we can.
Michael, you were muted. You were muted.
Sorry. Paul spoke for a second and then he got disconnected. So I've got the feeling it's going to take him a minute or two to get back into the meeting. So maybe while we're doing that, does anybody else want to say something, or do any of the, if they don't, oh, Paul's back. Paul, you were about to say something. This wouldn't happen if we were in the same room. I mean, somebody might fall out of the window, but that's kind of unlikely.
It also wouldn't happen. It also wouldn't happen if I wasn't an idiot and pressed the wrong button. I was just wondering about disagreements that are kind of so foundational to nursing orthodoxy and nursing practice that it's almost like kind of slaying a sacred god. So for example, you know, there's no need for compassion in nursing. It's just an example. But what do people kind of make of those sorts of disagreements that are so utterly foundational, not only philosophically, but against codes of practice and codes of ethics? Do you think people sort of saying those sorts of things are likely to come into, you know, they're so sort of outside nursing that people will just reject them on those grounds without really engaging with them? I mean, I say that because in the JME recently, in medical practice, the kind of notion of kindness and compassion in that sort of practice can legitimately be questioned. Doesn't seem to be something we could do in nursing. I'm not sure. I'm not saying I want to do that in nursing. I'm just wondering about the kind of foundational nature of these claims.
It's funny, that claim sounds like a slightly tired essay topic that you'd give to kind of undergraduates to kind of to stimulate them. But Martin.
Yeah, if I let me respond to Paul. The as we both know, there's a really interesting set of literatures around empathy and tolerance outside of nursing, which I was going to say problematizes, but I don't really like that word particularly, although I often feel forced to use it, that takes the concept of tolerance and empathy apart in large measure. And I think that there's a real problem insofar as within our own writing, within the boundaries of nursing literature, those types of debate and argument aren't given due prominence, because they do have something to say and they can inform our thinking around these topics like empathy and tolerance and many, many others as well. So if you're saying, can we attack the sacred cows, then I think to that extent, yes, because thinking through these issues does give us a different, wider, broader, whatever you want to say, a better perspective, and allows us then to have greater clarity in what we do think about these types of word. And yes, so in response to your question, I think not only can we, but we ought to, in my opinion. And just if I can follow on from that, many, many years ago, I went to Leeds to do a presentation in the business school on some aspect of methodology. And as far as I'm aware, I was the only nurse in the room. And the train was a bit slow and I turned up a bit late. And as I walked into the room, the speaker who was on before me was doing her thing. So I only had a few minutes to get myself together before being launched. But what I was suddenly aware of was with the very strange, to my experience, way in which the meeting was being conducted. It was an archetypal character. It was a caricature of a blood sport, where the speaker was, in this instance, said her thing, and then the questioning was not polite, was not generous. It was clinically incisive, a bit testosterone driven, very aggressive. And the speaker, who, when I was listening to, I thought, well, that's not I'm not too sure if I do agree with you, but she was torn apart by the audience. And at the time I thought, this is not what I'm used to and I don't like it and it's silly. But as the years have passed, I've become more I now think there is actually something in that. In nursing, we've all been to conference, we do our presentations, everyone claps politely, that's very nice. But we don't often get those killer incisive questions which really push us and trip us and destabilize what we have said. And my experience at Leeds, which I certainly didn't enjoy, nonetheless, at the end of that, I left knowing more. I'd learned something, and in relation to the other speakers who followed me, rather than just clapping politely, I walked away knowing that I gained something from that I wouldn't have gained had we just been polite to each other. So although there was a sort of over testosterone, over it was something, it was a blood sport. Nonetheless, as I've grown older and older, I really do begin to appreciate what comes out of that. And for all of its silliness, there is something in there. So going back to Paul's question, can we stab at sacred cows? I think perhaps we ought to sometimes, and we ought to perhaps at conference in response to papers be much more brutal with each other than we are used to being. And I think that possibly some positives could come out of that, although it would be very uncomfortable. It's much nicer when people don't do that to us. That's me.
Thanks, Martin. Sally, it seems that you want to respond to something here.
Yeah, just a quick response. I have a memory, and John probably will too, of an early philosophy nursing conference at Stirling, in which the members of the audience were so brutal to something that Philip Derbyshire was saying. I can't even remember what the argument was, but it created some lively pushback. And the very next speaker that came up to speak following that fainted on the stage and wasn't able to continue. So we do have a little bit of a history of making a debate into a blood sport in nursing, although I think we have become much tamer and calmer over time. But this caused me to reflect on Paul's really useful observation of do we really tolerate debate on those sacred issues such as compassion? Can you nurse without compassion? And I think we can so easily understand that as a very useful undergraduate classroom exercise, or an essay that people might write we're very good at doing that kind of conversation in the pretend. But I would argue that we have significant intolerance for that argument in the real, in someone who was intending to hold that position. As long as it's understood to be theoretical, we can go into those places and start to pull at the ideas. But I think collectively, there's something about nursing and its very unshakable commitment to certain kinds of deep core values, things that I would call nursing worldview. I know Martin may disagree with that. We've had some debate ourselves in the literature. But I think about those issues, I think that we have a great deal of time, a great deal of difficulty debating it. And it may well be that if we could find some sort of happy medium in which we could pick apart some of the foundations of the arguments and show one another what they look like, I don't believe we would shake apart our core mission and our sense of ourselves, but I think we might be able to understand a little bit more about what it implies. And because there always are possibilities into the future that we have missed an implication of something we hold to be true and we hold as unquestionable or unshakable, I think this is probably something we should try and figure out how to encourage in the next generation.
Thanks, Sally. Can I ask Zachary Daly, because what you have summarized there seemed to have some resonance to what Sally's just been saying, the difference between disagreement in a general sense and debate, which do seem slightly different. So if Zachary is around, it'd be great to hear from you.
Yeah, so it's just a question I had, is I think this is something that's coming up in everyone's responses and statements. So what speaker sees the difference or distinction between disagreement in a general sense and debate in the realm of academia? And then to the extent that there is a difference, sorry, that's my son sick in the background, you might hear some coughing. To the extent that there is a difference, where would disagreement in the setting of nursing education sit? Is that, in particular, I'm thinking not so much between academics, but say between a professor and a student. Thanks.
Okay, does anybody want to share some thoughts about that issue? Is that John? Is that your hand up, or is it Martin? Yep. It's John. Yes, yep. John.
On the way that Zachary put that, I would say that debate is what we call disagreement in an academic context. Sally's original contribution at the beginning when she mentioned the apocryphal moment when Wittgenstein and Popper had supposedly had an argument about a poker at the Moral Sciences Club. I wasn't around then, but I did attend the Moral Sciences Club for a while in the 70s. And one of the most formative, I think, experiences I had in the academic sense was attending one of those meetings where the main speaker and one of the hosts got involved in an extremely vehement debate. They were effectively, knocking seven bells out of each other. They were coming to blows, and there were no pokers raised or anything like that. But they were arguing, yes, vehemently, disagreeing, and the impression they gave was that they actually loathed each other. It was that bad. And at the end of the meeting, when the chair had closed it, they got up, they went over to each other, they shook hands, slapped each other's backs, and then went off for a drink. And we all retired to the nearest hostelry. And these two guys just chatted away for the rest of the evening. And the whole sense that somehow they really had a problem with each other at a personal level just evaporated. And as I say, for me, that was a really formative experience, because you can debate, you can disagree, you can argue really very vehemently indeed, but it's not personal. In a real sense, it's not personal. And that's one of the kind of, I think, academic skills that anybody in any discipline has to learn, that it's not personal. You have to be able to listen to the criticism, listen to the argument, and not take it personally. And it's a kind of skill that nobody talks about much, but I think it's a really, really important one. And it's a bit like, getting rejections from a journal or something. It hurts. It always does, even for experienced writers. It hurts. But it's something, again, that you have to learn to deal with, and to come back to what's been said and look at it from every possible angle that you can think of.
And also, it's not about winning. The point that John made earlier when he was talking, that the discussion, the debate, the argument is not necessarily about winning. It's about developing understanding into whatever it is you're discussing, and that's something which people don't seem to grasp always, because the presumption is that when you are arguing with someone that you're just trying to beat them, and just to repeat what you were saying, it's clearly not that, and that's just a comment.
Yeah. Barb, I have the sense, from your opening kind of talk, that you're speaking about something is slightly different to what we've just been talking about, and to me is more troubling and more disorientating. So you had your hand up, so I don't know what you were about to say, but.
Yeah, I'm going to follow up on that comment, Michael, and Zachary. I think this is a great question, and it's so interesting to listen to John and Martin, because I do think that this idea of academic debate, at least in probably the North American context, Canada in particular, is a bit of a lost art. And I think one of the reasons that we're really struggling with it is some of the other sort of social movements within North America that have really influenced this idea of whether debate is still proper. And there's a fantastic book out called The Coddling of the American Mind. And in that book, he really talks about the need that we have in academia to make students feel safe, and how so many of the ways that we're moving toward making students feel safe actually make them feel unsafe. So we have all of these assumptions about education, such that students are inherently vulnerable, that we have an obligation to create a classroom where there's very little controversy, and where students can come and feel this metaphorical safety, whatever that means. I haven't quite figured out what that is yet. But I think this is a compelling question, Zachary. We need to figure out how we take this art of academic debate forward while still respecting some of the things that we've learned about who can and cannot tolerate this debate, and who really doesn't even have the privilege of entering in because of their locations. And so thank you for bringing that question up. It's such a good one.
It's 20 to 7 here in the UK. And oh, Sally.
Just a thought to add to what Barb said. I'm really conscious of myself as a journal editor, having a little bit of control over what it is that authors receive when peer reviewers have articulated contentious ideas. And I personally, in my moral conscience, cannot allow some particularly vicious and peer reviews to go uninterpreted to an author. And I will, as an editor, comment. You know, you'll see reviewer number 2 takes a very strong view, and I'll give some kind of context to help soften that, for example. And there are certain, if it turns vulgar, I would take that out. But I'm reflecting as Barb and others are talking about that being a control function, that I am to some extent protecting people from the harm of what I, the editor, in my privileged position, am interpreting as a problematic comment. And yet, I think that I also believe that a vigorous and non-mean-spirited critique is probably the best gift that newer authors have when they're trying to work out their ideas and present their arguments logically. So it's a tricky thing. I know myself, I would try and attract very thoughtful, critical, logically disputed claims about a paper, claims about what it is one thinks when one reads a paper, how one experiences it as a reader. And yet there is a limit, I know, in my own mind, that because I can do this, I create the environment in which I do. I don't allow the bloodbath to go unfettered.
Yes, of all the kind of problems, this one seems a relatively kind of simple one. If it's possible to separate what Martin was calling sort of testosterone-filled kind of aggressiveness from robustness of critique, if it's possible to separate them, then you work with one and you don't with the other. But maybe it isn't always that simple. Paul, you've got your hand up. And I hope you don't fall out of the window this time.
Thanks. This is I mean, it's probably not the right time to ask this question, and I went out a bit then, so forgive me if you've already addressed this. But I'm kind of listening, and I'm noting how often the word debate is preceded by the word academic. And you know, one of the kind of general uses of the word academic is kind of, well, it's kind of meaningless, really. You know, it's all academic, it doesn't matter. And so I kind of like to ask the panelists, you know, how would they respond to a criticism of this whole debate, that actually it doesn't make any difference to nursing practice. And a couple of observations. One is in general life, that the standard of debate seems to be going down, in that you just get echo chambers and you get contradictory assertions rather than debates and arguments. And secondly, I've kind of never understood nursing practice as a practice that encourages active debate and, despite claims, active critical engagement with practice at a policy level and actually on the wards. So sorry, how would the panelists respond to that? You know, well, it's all very well, you know, but no one actually reads the journals. What difference it's going to make to the wards?
Panelists, we could wind up the evening at this point if that's too difficult to question. Yeah, over to you. Yeah, it's yes. I was going to say the elephant in the room. I don't know whether that's putting it too strongly, but Sally.
Yeah, I'm getting more than my share of the airtime. But when Paul was arguing that, became aware of how frequently the many students in our context who come into a master's program, who enter graduate school in nursing, come in because they've had those beginning debates and they don't know how to. They can see issues of logic going on in medical discourse, for example, around them, in ethical reasoning. They recognize that there is a place to be engaging with logic, and they haven't yet got the tools. So I see them as having it and needing it, but not having the tools until they've recognized in the practice context. And ideally, they find themselves then coming into graduate school and demanding that that be a significant focus of their education.
Thank you, Sally. Anybody else? Martin, can I just have a steer from you about the time? How are we? Should we wind up, or what? Or should we keep going? Or what?
Peter's got his hand up, but I think we ought to wrap up soon because it's gone on for it's nicely gone on for longer than I expected it to, and so it's probably time to begin to move. And also, I'm going to spend the next hour or two trying to work out if I have got an answer to Paul's question.
Yeah, no, they were good questions.
Yeah, Peter.
Okay, Peter, yeah.
There we go. Can you hear and see me?
Yes, we definitely can.
Right, okay.
Yeah.
I've joined very late to this, so I've missed an awful lot.
Yeah, you missed the wine.
Two thoughts I had. One was whether you'd made a distinction earlier on between rhetoric and dialectic from ancient sort of philosophy sources. But the other was to thinking about Paul's question, was that something that's in philosophy at the moment that is, you might call just an academic debate, is the debate about the definition of gender and the definition of sex. And if you want to think that's an academic debate that doesn't have any effect on the world and on nursing, for example, in relation to things like women-only spaces, then I think that would be a good example of one that does have an effect. And I've got a phone call now. I've got to go. Sorry.
It was nice to have you.
Yeah, I think an Aristotelian just entered.
Well, he hasn't turned his heating on yet, has he? He did look rather chilly. Martin,
shall we conclude then? Is that a good idea?
We've got to stop at some point.
Okay. Well, in that case, just let me say thank you very much, Michael, for chairing. Bob, John, Sally, thank you very much this evening for speaking, and thank you to everyone who attended or asked questions, or thank you very much indeed. And I hope people found it interesting.
Martin, I've got to say something. When people make comments, the sound effect is just like pulling the cork out of a bottle of wine, isn't it?
So what you're saying is you've been triggered or nudged?
Yes, both. Martin, thank you so much for organising it and the book, and thank you for all the speakers and all the people that took the trouble to be here. It's been really enjoyable. We scratched the surface, it feels like, really. But what more can you do in a world of complexity and values? Okay, so bye-bye everybody, and thanks again.
Oh, and it was recorded for those who want to go back, and super. Good night everybody, or good morning, depending on where you're situated.
See you. Lovely to see you all.
Cheers.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye, Janet.